The first thing Celia Mercer noticed when she stepped off the stagecoach in Harlan's Creek, Wyoming Territory, in the spring of 1878, was that the wind did not ask permission before it hit you. It simply arrived, relentless and certain, as though the whole of the frontier had been waiting to test her from the very first breath. She stood on the packed dirt of what passed for a main street, her single trunk at her feet, a carpetbag hanging from her left hand, and a letter folded inside the breast pocket of her traveling coat that she had read so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. The letter had come from a land agent named Thurston Price, promising 40 acres of good grazing land at reasonable terms to any settler willing to work it honestly, and Celia had answered that advertisement with every cent she had left in the world after burying her mother in St. Louis, and selling the house her father had left behind when consumption took him 3 winters before. She was 24 years old. She had no husband, no brother, no cousin with a strong back to help her. She had her own 2 hands and a stubbornness that her mother had always called her finest flaw, and she had decided that Wyoming Territory was exactly where a woman like her belonged. The town of Harlan's Creek was not much to look at in those first minutes. There was a general store with a hand-painted sign that had seen too many winters. There was a livery stable from which the smell of horses drifted warm and honest across the street. There was a saloon called the Red Antler with its doors swinging open even at this mid-morning hour. And there was a land office with a crooked flagpole out front from which an American flag moved in the same relentless wind that had greeted Celia the moment she arrived. She picked up her trunk by its worn leather handle and started walking toward the land office, because that was where the business was, and Celia had always been a woman who went straight to the business. She nearly walked directly into Oliver Wells. He came around the corner of the general store at a long-legged stride, carrying a coil of fence wire over one shoulder and a burlap sack of something heavy in his other hand, and they avoided a full collision only because Celia stepped sideways with quick instinct, and Oliver managed to halt his own momentum by planting one boot hard in the dirt. The fence wire swung on his shoulder, and the burlap sack thumped against his hip, and for a moment they simply stared at each other across the narrow strip of air between them. Oliver Wells was somewhere in the neighborhood of 28 or 29, though the Wyoming sun had given him the kind of weathered look that could make a man seem ageless in certain lights. He was tall and lean in the way that hard outdoor work produces, with dark hair that curled at the edges from under the brim of a brown hat that had been through considerable weather. His jaw was shadowed with 2 days of beard, and his eyes were a particular shade of gray that Celia would later decide she had never seen on another living person, the color of the sky in the hour just before rain, when everything still and uncertain meets everything about to break open. He looked at her for a full 3 seconds without speaking, which was 3 seconds longer than most men in Harlan's Creek had ever needed to assess a new arrival and form an opinion. Celia looked back without blinking, which was something she had learned from her mother, who had always said that the first person to look away lost something they could not name. "My apologies," Oliver said, and his voice was low and direct, carrying none of the affected charm that some men put on like Sunday coats when they saw a woman traveling alone. "I was not watching where I was going." "Neither was I," Celia said, which was not entirely true, but she saw no reason to give him the full advantage of the moment. "I am looking for the land office. Can you point me toward it?" He studied her again for a half-second more before he tilted his head toward the building with the crooked flagpole. "That is it directly across the street." "I can see that now that you have pointed it out," Celia said. "Thank you." She moved a step around him and he stepped aside to let her pass, which she appreciated because some men in that era made a theatrical production of the stepping aside. She was 3 paces past him when he said, without turning, "Thurston Price is in there, but he will try to charge you for the survey fee on top of the purchase price. The survey was done 2 years ago by the county and he knows it. Do not let him add it to your bill." Celia stopped. She turned slowly and looked at him over her shoulder. "How do you know I am going to buy land?" Oliver adjusted the coil of wire on his shoulder and met her look with the same directness she had been giving him. "Because you are carrying a carpetbag and a trunk, and you walked off that stagecoach with the look of a woman who has already made up her mind about something permanent. A woman who has made up her mind about something permanent in this town is either getting married or buying land, and you do not have the look of someone waiting for a husband." There was no insult in it. He said it as plainly and factually as he might have observed the direction of the wind or the height of the grass, and Celia found to her own surprise that she did not want to argue with him. "Thank you for the warning," she said. "I will keep it in mind." She went into the land office, and Oliver Wells went on his way with his fence wire and his burlap sack, and neither of them said anything more about it that morning. But Harlan's Creek was a small town, and small towns have a way of arranging things. Thurston Price was a soft, damp-looking man in his 50s with the kind of smile that showed too many teeth and promised too many things. He had papers spread across a wide desk, and he welcomed Celia with the particular enthusiasm that land agents reserved for buyers who arrived alone, calculating. Celia could see it happening behind his eyes, that a solitary woman might be easier to move than a couple, or a man with a lawyer friend. He was wrong, and she spent the better part of an hour proving it. When he mentioned the survey fee, and he did mention it, tucked casually into the list of closing costs as though it were as natural as breathing, Celia set down her carpetbag and folded her hands on the desk and looked at him with the calm, considered expression of a woman who has already been told what to expect. The survey on Section 14 of the Mercer parcel was completed in the spring of 1876 by the county assessor's office, she said. "I know this because I wrote to the county assessor's office before I ever purchased my stagecoach ticket, and they were good enough to reply in writing." She produced the letter from her carpetbag and set it on the desk between them. "The survey is on record and the fee is not applicable. Shall we continue without it?" Thurston Price's smile changed shape several times before it settled into something that might have been respect, or might have been defeat, which in this particular instance was close enough to the same thing. She signed the papers on 40 acres at the agreed price, paid the first installment from the money she had carried sewn into the lining of her traveling coat, all the way from St. Louis, and walked out of the land office in the mid-morning light with the deed folded carefully inside her carpetbag, the legal owner of a piece of Wyoming Territory that she had never laid eyes on. She stood on the wooden sidewalk and breathed the sharp, clean air of the high plains and felt something shift in her chest, not quite joy, not quite fear, but some particular combination of the two that she had no single word for. "He tried to charge you for the survey," she turned. Oliver Wells was leaning against the hitching rail outside the general store, apparently having completed whatever errand had brought him to town, and was watching her with the easy patience of a man with no pressing place to be at the moment. "He tried," Celia said, "but he did not succeed. He did not." Oliver looked at her with something that was not quite a smile, more like the first motion of one, the way a river looks just before it turns. "You want someone to take you out to the parcel. I know the sections out there. I have my wagon." It was a practical offer. She had no horse, no wagon, no way of reaching 40 acres of Wyoming land on her own 2 feet before dark. Accepting a stranger's help was not her preference, but the frontier did not always offer comfortable preferences. "I will pay you for the time," she said. "No need," Oliver said, straightening from the rail and settling his hat more squarely on his head. "I ride past Section 14 on the way to my own property. It is no inconvenience." She thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. "All right," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Wells," he said. "Oliver Wells." "Celia Mercer," she said, and they shook hands with the same directness they had shown each other from the beginning, and that was how the whole thing started. The wagon ride took the better part of an hour, out along a dirt track that wound through stands of cottonwood, and across a shallow creek that ran cold and clear from somewhere in the hills to the north. Oliver drove with the easy competence of a man who had made this particular trip hundreds of times, handling the reins lightly, letting the horses find their own rhythm on the familiar track. For the first quarter of an hour they did not speak, and the silence was not uncomfortable. The land opened around them vast, rolling, green from the spring rains, broken here and there by outcroppings of pale stone and the dark line of tree-filled creek beds cutting down through the hills. Sky was enormous. Celia had expected that, having read about it in letters and newspapers and the accounts of travelers, but the reality of it was different from reading about it. The sky here was not merely large, it was a presence, a participant in the landscape, pressing down blue and brilliant and full of weather possibility in a way that the sky over St. Louis streets had never managed to be. "You came alone," Oliver said after a while. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Celia said. "From where?" "St. Louis," he considered this. "Long way." "It is," she agreed. "You have experience with farming, ranching." She turned to look at him, but his eyes were on the track ahead, the horse's ears, the horizon, conducting the ordinary surveillance of a man who knows that attentiveness in open country is not paranoia but common sense. "My father kept a garden and a few chickens. Before that, his family farmed in Ohio. I know how to work." "Farming in Missouri and ranching in Wyoming Territory are not the same proposition," Oliver said, and his tone carried no cruelty, only the flat honesty of the frontier, which had no patience for comfortable fictions. "The winters here are harder than most people expect. The summer can be dry enough to break your heart. The grass fires come without much warning. The water rights are a constant fight, and there are ranchers in this valley who have very fixed ideas about who has the right to land and water, and they are not always prepared to accept a new neighbor peacefully." Celia listened to all of this with the quiet attention she had always brought to information she needed, absorbing each point, filing it, weighing it. When he finished, she said, "The frontier would never be easy, I expect." "It would not," Oliver said. "Not for anyone, not for someone on their own." She looked at him then, and perhaps he felt it because he glanced briefly sideways to meet her eyes before returning his attention to the track. She said, quietly and with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than argument, "Good. I did not come here for easy." Something happened in Oliver Wells's face when she said that, some small interior rearrangement that was not dramatic enough to be called a change, but was real enough that she saw it and remembered it later, turning it over in her mind the way you turn over a curious stone to examine what is underneath. He nodded once and said nothing more about the difficulty of the frontier, and they rode the rest of the way to Section 14 in a silence that felt, to Celia, different from the first silence, warmer, somehow, and more settled. The land, when they reached it, was beautiful in the particular way of places that have never been asked to be anything but themselves. It was a gentle rise of open grassland backed by a ridge of low hills, with a creek running along the eastern boundary, and a grove of cottonwood and willow along the creek that provided both shelter and shade. There was a small cabin near the center of the parcel. The advertisement had mentioned a cabin, but Celia had allowed herself no expectations about what that word might mean in Wyoming Territory, and she had been right to be cautious. The cabin was single-roomed, built of logs that had been there long enough to go silver-gray, with a fieldstone chimney that leaned slightly to one side and a door that would need a new set of leather hinges before the season was out. But the bones were solid. She could see that. She walked the perimeter of it, pressed her hands against the logs, looked up at the roof where someone had laid shakes of split pine that were aging but still sound, and felt the same unnameable thing she had felt outside the land office, that combination of fear and joy that had no single word. Oliver stood back and let her look, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. He had the patience to understand that some assessments needed to be made in a person's own time. "The chimney needs repointing," she said finally. "It does," he agreed. "And the door hinges." "Yes, The roof will last another season. He had walked under the eave and was looking up at the shakes with a practiced eye. 2 if we get no ice storms. 1 for certain. She noticed the "we" but filed it away without comment. She turned to look at the creek, glittering through the cottonwoods in the afternoon light, and said, "Is the water reliable?" "It runs year-round," Oliver said, "fed from snowmelt higher up. It has never gone dry in the 4 years I have been in this valley." She turned to look at him then with genuine curiosity. "How long have you been here?" "I came out in 1874, he said. "Bought the section adjacent to the north of yours." He tilted his head to indicate the direction. "My cabin is about 3/4 of a mile that way through the cottonwoods. You would be my nearest neighbor." Celia took a moment to absorb this arrangement. "You have been here 4 years alone?" "Yes," he said, without elaborating, and something in the single syllable suggested that there was more to the story but that this was not the moment for it. And Celia, who had learned in her own life the value of not pressing people for what they were not yet ready to give, did not ask. She turned back to her cabin. She squared her shoulders and said, "I will need to go back to town for supplies. Flour, salt, lamp oil, seeds if the general store has them. And I will need tools, a good axe, a hand saw, some cement for the chimney." "Mortar," Oliver said. "For the chimney you want mortar, not cement. I have some already made up from when I repointed my own. You can have what is left." He paused. "And Mrs. Elliott at the general store usually keeps a fair supply of garden seeds in the spring. You will want to get them in the ground within the next 3 weeks if you want a summer harvest." "How do you know so much about what a person needs?" she asked, genuinely curious rather than challenging. He thought about it for a moment, as though the question deserved a real answer rather than a quick one. "I made all the mistakes myself when I first came out," he said. "It is easier to see them clearly from the other side." They drove back to town in the late afternoon gold of the spring sun, and Celia bought her supplies, more than she could carry in one load, and Oliver loaded them into the wagon without being asked. He drove her back to the property as the sun touched the tops of the western hills, and helped her carry everything inside, and lit the lamp in the cabin while she organized her provisions with the systematic efficiency that had always been her nature. When he was leaving, standing in the doorway with the evening light behind him turning everything amber, she said, "Mr. Wells, I appreciate your help today." "Oliver," he said, "out here the mister seems like a lot of work." She almost smiled. Oliver then, "Thank you. Welcome to Harlan's Creek, Miss Mercer," he said, and he settled his hat, and he was gone into the warm Wyoming evening, and Celia stood in the doorway of her new cabin and listened to the creek running through the cottonwoods and the first night sounds of the prairie rising around her, and felt, for the first time in 2 years, something that might have been the beginning of peace. The first weeks were the hardest she had ever known and the most satisfying. She rose before the sun every morning because the day was long and there was never enough of it, and she worked until the light failed, and then she worked a little longer by lamplight. She repointed the chimney with the mortar Oliver had left for her, mixing it to the right consistency by trial and error, and one good reference in the Wyoming Territory Homesteader's Almanac she had purchased at the general store. She replaced the door hinges with new ones cut from a hide she bought from the tannery at the edge of town, learning the cutting and piercing by instinct and by stubbornness. She got her garden seeds in the ground with 12 days to spare before Oliver's deadline, laying out neat rows with a length of twine, and marking each row with a stick and a piece of torn cloth with the seed name written on it in pencil. She was not without help, and she was honest with herself about that. Oliver Wells appeared regularly in those first weeks, not so often as to be intrusive and not so rarely as to be indifferent. He appeared when there was something specific to address. He came the morning after she had wrestled with the question of how to patch a gap in the cabin's north wall where the chinking had fallen away, and he showed her the right technique with mud and grass packed together and dried in the sun. He came with a load of timber he had cut from a stand of pine on his own property, and helped her build a small lean-to shed against the south wall of the cabin where she could store her tools, and eventually, she hoped, a cow. He never stayed for dinner unless she asked him to, and she found herself asking more often as the weeks passed, not out of obligation, but because she had discovered that Oliver Wells was one of those rare people who could fill an evening's conversation without ever making you feel crowded. He knew the valley thoroughly, its weather patterns, its soil types, which parts of the creek were good for fish, and which of the hills were likely to draw lightning in a summer storm. He knew the other settlers in the area and spoke of them with the particular mix of practicality and fairness that Celia had come to recognize as one of the ways he moved through the world. He had opinions, but he held them lightly enough to revise them when given reason, which was a quality she had always admired and seldom found. She told him in pieces about St. Louis, about her father's illness and death, about her mother's long, slow decline afterward, the way grief could hollow a person out if they let it settle instead of moving through it, about the decision to come west, which had not been an impulsive one. She had thought about it for 2 full years, saving money, researching, corresponding with the land agent and the county assessor's office, and 3 separate people who had already made the journey to Wyoming Territory. She was not a woman who leaped without looking. She was a woman who looked very carefully, and then leaped with everything she had. Oliver listened to all of it with the same attentive patience he brought to everything. He did not offer unnecessary sympathy, and he did not make her story smaller by comparing it to other people's difficulties. He simply received it, and that was enough, and more than enough. He told her, in the same slow pieces, about himself. He had grown up in Kentucky, the 3rd son of a tobacco farmer who had enough land for 2 sons and enough work for 5. He had come west not out of grand romantic ambition, but out of simple arithmetic. There was not enough in Kentucky, and there was, potentially, enough in Wyoming. He had spent 2 years working on a cattle drive before he had saved enough to buy his section, and those 2 years had taught him more about weather and animals and land than any previous decade of his life. He had been engaged once, briefly, to a woman in Cheyenne. He told Celia this on a May evening when they were sitting on the step of her cabin watching the last of the light leave the sky, and he told it in the same direct way he told everything, with no drama and no self-pity. The woman's name had been Alina, and she had decided, after 2 months of thinking about it, that Wyoming Territory was not a life she wanted, and she had gone back to her family in Ohio, and that had been 3 years ago. He did not say he was still heartbroken over it, and he did not say he was entirely past it. And Celia, who understood the particular gradations of that kind of loss, did not ask him to sort it into a neater package. "It changed the way I thought about this place," he said, looking out at the darkening valley. "Not whether I wanted to be here, I always wanted to be here, but what I was building it for and who might share it. It made me think more carefully about those questions." Celia looked at the side of his face in the last light and said, "And have you answered them?" He turned to look at her, and the evening had dimmed enough that she could not read his expression with complete certainty, but she thought there was something there, something warm and careful, and choosing its moment with patience. "I think," he said slowly, "that some questions answer themselves when you are not watching for them too hard." It was early June when the trouble with Harlan Tate began, and in the way of trouble in Wyoming Territory in 1878, it arrived without much ceremony. Harlan Tate was the largest landowner in the valley, a cattle rancher who had been in the territory since before most of the current settlers and who had operated, for most of that time, with the comfortable assumption that the open range was his to use as he saw fit. He was not an evil man in the straightforward sense of the word, but he was a man with a very fixed idea of the natural order of things, and that natural order placed him at the top of it, and any arrangement that suggested otherwise, such as a young woman from St. Louis owning 40 acres of good grazing land that his cattle had been ranging across freely for years, represented a kind of insult to his understanding of the world. He came to see Celia on a Tuesday morning in early June, riding up with 2 of his ranch hands behind him, which was the frontier equivalent of showing up to a negotiation with visual aids. Celia was in her garden when they arrived. She straightened from where she had been weeding a row of beans and shaded her eyes against the morning sun and watched them ride up without moving from her spot between the rows. Harlan Tate was a big man in his mid-50s with iron-gray hair and the red, weather-beaten face of someone who had spent decades outdoors in conditions that were not always kind. He sat his horse with the easy authority of a man who had never had reason to doubt that authority, and he looked down at Celia and her garden with an expression that was not quite contempt but was in the neighborhood of it. "You are the Mercer woman," he said. "I am," Celia said. "Bought Section 14. "I did. The deed is on file with the county clerk in Laramie if you would like to verify it." He looked at the garden, the cabin, the small shed she had built with Oliver's help. "Your fence line is interfering with my cattle's access to the creek," he said. "My fence line is on my property," Celia said, "as surveyed in 1876 and confirmed by my deed. If your cattle have been using my creek access, that is because no fence was in place before I arrived, not because you have any right to it." Tate's expression tightened. "I have been running cattle through this section for 8 years, he said. "I understand that," Celia said, keeping her voice level and clear. "And I have every sympathy for the inconvenience of changing a long-standing practice. However, the law of this territory is clear on the matter of property rights, and I am afraid sympathy does not supersede the deed." One of the ranch hands behind Tate shifted in his saddle, and Celia noticed it without letting her attention move from Tate's face. "There are ways things are done in this valley," Tate said, and his tone had shifted slightly, not quite threatening, but pressing toward it, the way weather can press toward a storm while still maintaining a clear sky. "New arrivals would do well to understand that." "I am sure they would," Celia said, "and I appreciate the guidance. But I expect I will do things the way the law does them, which I am told tends to work out satisfactorily for people in the right." For a long moment Tate looked at her with the expression of a man recalculating, and then he pulled his horse around and rode away without another word, his ranch hands following, and the dust of their departure drifted over Celia's bean rows, and she stood in it until it settled before going back to her weeding. She told Oliver about it that evening, because he was her neighbor, and because the situation affected him as well. Tate's cattle had ranged across Oliver's section too, though Oliver had fenced most of his property by the time Celia arrived, which she understood now had not been purely for practical reasons. Oliver listened with the expression he had when he was thinking carefully rather than quickly. "Tate is not going to give up his access to that creek quietly," he said. "He has the water rights on the western side of the valley, but the creek on your boundary is better flow and closer to his summer range. He has been depending on it without legal right for years." "I know," Celia said. "I read the water rights filings at the county office before I signed the deed. His access to my creek boundary is not documented anywhere." Oliver looked at her with the expression she had begun to recognize as the one that surfaced when she did something that confirmed a particular quality he had been observing. "You went to the county office before you bought the land." "Of course," she said, "in Laramie, which is a full day's ride from Harlan's Creek." "I went before I came out," she said. "I wrote letters. The county clerk was very cooperative." Oliver was quiet for a moment, and then he said, almost to himself, "Lord, you came prepared." It might have been the nicest thing anyone had ever said to her, and she told him so, and he laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere genuine, and it was the first time she had heard it, and she found that she wanted to hear it again. The situation with Tate did not resolve itself cleanly or quickly, because things in Wyoming Territory in 1878 rarely did. Over the following weeks there were small incidents. A section of her fence cut one night, which she repaired in the morning without ceremony. 3 of Tate's cattle found their way onto her property, which she drove off with the same patience she brought to weeding. A hand she did not recognize rode past her cabin 3 evenings in a row at dusk, not close enough to constitute anything actionable, but close enough to be noticed. She noticed, and she wrote it all down in a journal she kept with careful dates and descriptions, because she understood that in any dispute that eventually required a legal resolution, the record was as important as the facts. Oliver was furious about the fence, in the quiet, cold way that was more alarming than any visible temper. He came over the morning she found it cut and looked at the clean, straight cuts in the wire. They had been made with tools, not made by animals, and his jaw set in a way she had not seen before. "I should go see Tate," he said. "You should not," Celia said. "Not today, not like this. Today we fix the fence and we let him know by the fixing of it that cutting it accomplished nothing." Oliver looked at her and the hard set of his jaw eased slightly. "You are not afraid of him," he said. "I am cautious of him," she said. "That is different from afraid. A person can be cautious of something and still deal with it squarely." He helped her fix the fence that morning, and they worked side by side in the early summer warmth, stretching and stapling the wire back to the posts, and the work was companionable and real in the way that shared practical effort always is. And Celia found herself thinking, as she thought sometimes in unguarded moments, how natural it had become to have Oliver Wells in the landscape of her days, as natural as the creek and the cottonwoods and the enormous Wyoming sky. It was in July that things between them broke open, not dramatically but inevitably. The way ground that has been soaking for days eventually gives way. They had been out late one evening fixing a section of her roof, where the shakes had lifted in a wind. Oliver had climbed up, and she had handed materials up from below, and they had worked until the last of the long summer twilight finally surrendered to dark. And by the time they came down and washed the dust off their hands at the pump, it was well past the hour for Oliver to reasonably ride back to his property. "Stay for supper," Celia said, and it was not the first time she had said it, but something in the way she said it this time was different, quieter, less like practical hospitality, and more like something she actually wanted, and she heard the difference even as she said it. Oliver heard it too. He looked at her across the lamplight falling from the open cabin door and said, "Celia," just her name. But the way he said it held about a dozen different things inside it, and she stood very still and let him find the words for them. "I have been trying very carefully," he said, "not to impose myself on something that you have built here on your own terms. Because it is your land and your choice and your life, and you made it perfectly clear from the beginning that you did not come here to have anyone make things easier for you." "I did not," she agreed softly. "But I find that he stopped and started again, which was not his usual way, and the stopping and starting told her something important. "I find that I am here because I want to be here, not because I feel obligated to be, and I think you know that. I think you have known it for a while." "I have," she said. "And I do not know what you want," he said. "I know what I want, but this is your life and I would rather ask directly than assume anything." She looked at him in the lamplight, this man who had helped her mortar a chimney and build a shed and fix a fence, and who had never once suggested by word or action that the assistants made any claim on her, who had listened to her stories and told his own and laughed his real laugh, and who looked at her sometimes in the early morning when they were working together in the garden in a way that made her feel entirely and specifically seen. "You could ask," she said. "May I court you, Celia Mercer?" he said. Straight out, plain and real, no performance in it, in the full and proper sense, with everything that means. "Yes," she said, "you may." He smiled then, not the almost smile she had been collecting since the beginning, but a full one, which changed his whole face and made him look younger and more open and very much himself. And she smiled back, and the night settled warm and easy around them, and Oliver stayed for supper, and they talked for hours in the lamplight until the candle burned low, and it was a very good evening. The summer of 1878 in Wyoming Territory was one of those summers that people who lived through it talked about for years afterward, long and brilliant, and full of heat and color, the grass growing tall and green until July when it burned to gold, the creek running clear and cold from the high snowfields, the nights cool enough to sleep under a blanket even after days that were blazing hot. For Celia, That summer became the backdrop of something she had not expected to find when she stepped off the stagecoach in Harlan's Creek. Something large and certain and warm that grew steadily through the weeks of hard work and long evenings and mornings. When Oliver appeared in the distance across the creek in the gold early light, and she felt her whole body orient toward him like a compass finding north. He courted her the way he did everything with attention and patience and no wasted motion. He brought her things that were useful: a wheel of good wax for waterproofing her boots, a book on Wyoming Territory plants that would help her identify which ones were edible and which medicinal, a 2-quart milk can when she finally bought the cow she had been saving for. He brought her things that were not purely practical: 2 wildflowers once, a bunch of them that he left on her doorstep without announcement, purple and yellow mountain flowers from the hillside above his property that she put in a tin cup of water on the windowsill where they lasted 3 days, and she looked at them every morning with a feeling she had stopped trying to name and simply allowed. He took her riding on the Sundays when neither of them had pressing work out across the high ground north of the valley, where the view opened up into a vastness that made Celia feel simultaneously very small and very large, as though the land contained you and enlarged you at the same time. She was not an experienced rider, and she told him so, and he found her a steady mare named Biscuit from the livery who took her across the country without incident, and Oliver rode alongside her on his own horse, a dark bay gelding called Rem, and they talked and were quiet in the pleasant alternation that had become the native rhythm of their time together. He kissed her for the first time in early August, on the bank of the creek, where the cottonwoods made a green shade in the afternoon heat. They had been sitting there after a morning of fence work, their boots off, their feet in the cold water, and she had been telling him something funny about a letter she had received from her cousin in St. Louis who wanted to know if Wyoming Territory was as wild as the newspapers suggested, and Oliver had been watching her face while she talked, and when she finished the sentence, she turned to find him watching her with an expression that was so naked and unguarded that it stopped her mid-breath. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of her hair behind her ear, the gesture slow and careful, and then he leaned in and kissed her, very gently, the first kiss tasting of creek water and summer and the specific warmth of his hands which were always warm and always careful. When they parted, he said, "I have been wanting to do that for about 3 months." "Since the end of April, then," Celia said. "You have been counting too." "I have," she said, and kissed him again, and the creek ran cold around their feet and the cottonwood leaves moved in the warm summer air, and Celia Mercer, who had come to Wyoming Territory to build something permanent and real, felt with a clarity that startled her how much more permanent and real everything had become. The trouble with Harlan Tate came to its head in September, and it came in the form of a legal notice. The notice arrived via the county sheriff's office. A thin man named Beaumont who seemed embarrassed about the whole business, but was doing his job informing Celia that Tate was filing a claim of adverse possession on the creek access, arguing that his 8 years of uncontested use of the creek boundary established a legal right that superseded her deed. Celia read the notice twice, set it on her table, and thought about it for 10 minutes with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup. Then she put her boots on and rode Biscuit to Oliver's property. He was at his barn when she arrived, and he saw her expression before she had said a word and came to meet her at the gate. She showed him the notice. He read it with the same careful attention he brought to everything and then looked up. "Can he do that?" Celia asked. "He is trying to," Oliver said. "The legal doctrine exists. Whether it applies here depends on whether his use was truly uncontested. Did you or anyone else ever formally notify him to stay off the creek boundary before you bought the property?" "The previous owner of the deed was an estate," Celia said. "A man who died in 1875 and left no heirs. No one was managing the property for 3 years before I bought it. Tate's cattle used it freely because there was no one to contest it," Oliver thought. "The doctrine typically requires the use to be hostile to the owner's rights, not merely tolerated by absence. 3 years of use against an unoccupied estate is different from use against an active owner. He paused. But this needs a lawyer, Celia, not just us arguing it. I know, she said. There is a lawyer in Laramie. I looked him up before I ever bought the deed. His name is Marcus Webb. He handles land disputes. Oliver looked at her with the expression she loved, the one that was equal parts admiration and something deeper than admiration. Of course you looked him up, he said. We should go to Laramie, she said. Can you come? Try to stop me, he said, which made her reach out and squeeze his hand, which was something she did now without thinking about it, and he turned his hand under hers and held on. They rode to Laramie 2 days later, a full day's journey, and spent the night at a reputable boarding house. Oliver in a room on the 2nd floor, and Celia in a room on the 3rd, both of them entirely proper and both of them aware of the other's nearness in the dark, and quiet of the boarding house in a way that made the night feel both long and very short. Marcus Webb was a spare, dry man of 50 who had been practicing land law in Wyoming Territory for 15 years, and who received Celia's documentation, the deed, the county assessor's letter, her journal of the incident since her arrival, and the water rights filings she had retrieved from the county clerk, with the particular expression of a professional who was meeting a client who has done a significant portion of the work themselves. Miss Mercer, he said, looking at the journal, this is a thorough record. I anticipated it might be needed, Celia said. Adverse possession in this territory requires that the use be open, notorious, continuous, hostile, and exclusive for the requisite period, Webb said. 3 years against an unoccupied estate is a weak foundation. Tate's lawyer will argue it was 7 years before the estate period, going back to when the original owner was alive. He tapped the deed. Can you establish that the original owner contested Tate's use? I cannot, Celia said. But I can establish that the original owner sold the property to an estate in 1872, and the estate's records, which I also obtained from the county court, show no correspondence with Tate and no acknowledgement of any grazing arrangement. The absence of any license agreement actually supports the hostile requirement, but it undermines the continuity argument because a hostile use implies opposition, and there was no opposition because there was no active owner. Webb looked at Oliver. Oliver looked back with an expression of calm pride. Webb looked at Celia. You have given this considerable thought, he said. It is my land, Celia said simply. Webb took the case. He was confident enough to quote her a flat fee rather than an hourly rate, which she took as a good sign, and she paid half of it from her savings and promised the rest when the matter was resolved. They rode home in the long golden afternoon of a September day, the land rolling away on either side of them in the autumn colors that were just beginning, the cottonwoods yellowing, the hills going russet and amber, and the sky above them was the clear, ringing blue of high country fall. You know, Oliver said, after they had ridden in comfortable silence for a while, when you first got off that stagecoach, I thought you might last a month. Oh, Celia said. Not because of any lack of character, he said quickly. Because the country here breaks people. It broke people I thought were harder than nails, people who had been farming all their lives in places with worse winters than Wyoming. It is something about the scale of it, the loneliness, the uncompromising nature of the place. He paused. I thought you might last a month, and then I watched you work, and I revised that estimate upward every week until I stopped making estimates altogether. When did you stop making estimates? She asked. About 3 weeks in, he said. When I came over to show you how to pack the chimney mortar, and found you had already done it yourself, and done it correctly. She laughed, and he smiled his full smile, and the horses walked on in the autumn light, and they were, without either of them having made a formal announcement about it, completely and wholeheartedly in love. The legal matter with Tate resolved itself in November, when Marcus Webb presented the case before the county court in Laramie, and Tate's lawyer, faced with Celia's documentation, the water rights filings, and the specific application of territorial law on adverse possession, offered a settlement. Tate would withdraw his claim in exchange for a licensed crossing right at the southern boundary of the creek access, allowing his cattle to use a specific, fenced crossing point for watering. The crossing right would be formally documented, time-limited to daylight hours, and would come with an annual fee paid to Celia. It was not a perfect resolution, but it was a practical one, and more importantly, it was a legal one, documented, bounded, and enforceable. Celia discussed it with Oliver and with Marcus Webb, and then she accepted it, because she had not come to Wyoming Territory to wage wars but to build something, and this arrangement allowed building to proceed. Tate, when the documents were signed, came to Celia's property alone, no ranch hands, no theatrics, and he stood his horse at her gate and looked at her with an expression that had more in it than she had expected. "You did not back down," he said. "I did not," Celia said. "Most people do," he said. "When I push." "I notice that is how you expected it to go," she said, without particular heat. He looked at her a moment longer and then he said, somewhat stiffly, "The arrangement is fair. I acknowledge that." It was not a full apology, but she understood it was the closest thing to one she was likely to get, and she received it as such. "I hope we can be reasonable neighbors going forward," she said. "We can try," Tate said, and rode away, and that was more or less that. The winter of 1878 came hard in December, as Wyoming Territory winters do, arriving without much subtlety and settling in with the determination of a long-term resident. The snow came first as a skiff, then as a serious presence, and then 1 week in January as a genuine storm that kept Celia inside her cabin for 3 days with her provisions and her lamp and her fire, and the copy of Adam Bede she had carried from St. Louis tucked under her arm. Oliver came through the storm to check on her on the second day, wading through the snow that had come up to his thigh in the drifts between the cottonwoods, and when she opened the door to find him there with snow packed on every surface of him and his breath coming in clouds in the cold air, she felt something so large and clear it took her breath away for a moment. "You walked through a blizzard," she said. "It is not technically a blizzard," he said, stomping snow off his boots on the step. "A blizzard requires sustained winds above 35 miles per hour. Oliver." "Yes, come inside." He came inside and she made him coffee and they sat by the fire, and outside the winter continued its business without reference to them, and inside the firelight made the cabin warm and close and golden, and at some point during the second hour Celia set down her coffee cup and looked at him and said, "Oliver, I want to ask you something." "Ask," he said. "What are you building?" she said. "I know you have your land and your cattle and your plans for expanding the herd. But what is it for, the way you talked about that time in May? What are you building it toward?" He looked at her for a long time in the firelight, and she could see him choosing his words with the care he always brought to things that mattered. "I am building it toward a life," he said. "A full one, with work I am proud of and land that is healthy and a home that is real, occupied in the proper sense, with everything that means." He paused. "I have been building toward you, Celia, since September of last year, if I am being entirely honest about the timeline." She sat with this for a moment. Then she said, "September. We had only been neighbors for a few weeks in September." "I know," he said. "I have always been good at recognizing important things quickly. It is the acting on them that I sometimes do slowly." She stood up and crossed the short distance between their chairs and sat down beside him on the low bench by the hearth, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and the fire crackled and the snow pressed against the windows, and the winter was very large and very cold outside, and in the cabin it was very warm. "Oliver," she said. "Yes," he said. "Ask me," she said. He turned to look at her and she looked back, and the firelight was doing extraordinary things to both of their faces. "Celia Mercer," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "I will." He kissed her then in a way that was different from the summer kisses by the creek, something in it that was not tentative or exploratory but certain, like something that had been building its whole pressure for months finally given room to be what it was. They married in March of 1879, when the worst of the winter was past, but the air still had the clean, cold sharpness of the season in it. The ceremony was in the small church at Harlan's Creek, conducted by the Reverend Dalton, who was a practical and pleasant man who had performed marriages in considerably more unusual circumstances than this one, and who seemed genuinely pleased by the evident affection of the parties involved. The whole valley turned out for it, or nearly so. The Elliott family from the general store, the Beaumont family, 3 other homesteading families who had arrived in the valley in the past 2 years, and who had found in Celia a model of persistence that they spoke of with admiration. Even Harlan Tate appeared in the back pew with his wife, a quiet, composed woman named Margaret who caught Celia's eye during the ceremony and gave her a small, real smile that Celia returned. Celia wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had ordered from a dressmaker in Laramie in January, giving the dress 3 months to arrive and be altered. It fit her perfectly, a small thing that nonetheless felt like a good omen. Oliver wore his best coat, which he had cleaned and pressed, and he had shaved and cut his hair, and when she walked down the center aisle toward him and he turned to look at her, his expression was the most open and undefended thing she had ever seen on his face, and she walked toward it with her heart in her throat and her chin up and her eyes clear. The Reverend spoke the words and they said the words back, and when Oliver put the ring on her finger, a simple gold band that he had ordered from the jeweler in Laramie and paid for with a summer's worth of extra cattle work, his hands were very steady, which she noticed because she was paying attention to everything, storing it all, because she understood even in the moment that this was one of those days you go back to in your memory for the rest of your life. Afterward there was a gathering at the Red Antler, which in the afternoon had a different quality than in the evening, more sunlight through the windows, children underfoot, the long tables set with food that the wives of the valley had contributed in a practical gesture of community that moved Celia deeply. There was fiddle music and dancing on the cleared floor, and Oliver danced with her in the serious but willing way of a man who is not naturally a dancer, but will do anything that is asked of him in a good cause. And she laughed at his earnestness, and he laughed at himself, and they danced 3 full dances before the room required him for other duties. That evening they rode home together to Celia's cabin, which had always been the larger and more livable of the 2, and to which Oliver had already moved his most necessary possessions over the previous weeks, and the valley was painted in the long, lavender light of a March sunset, and the creek was running high with the first snowmelt, and everything smelled of cold earth and new water and pine. And Celia sat beside her husband on the wagon seat and thought that she could not have drawn up a better life than this if she had been given unlimited time and imagination. They spent that summer building. Not only the practical building, the new bedroom added to the east side of the cabin, the enlarged kitchen with proper shelving, the bigger stable that could accommodate 4 horses and a milk cow comfortably, but the building of a life that was larger and more textured than either of them had been living alone. Oliver brought his cattle over and merged the herd, and they ran the combined property together with a shared management that was equal parts Oliver's 4 years of experience and Celia's gift for organization and forward planning. The garden expanded. She learned to preserve in earnest the stone crock pickles, the glass jars of tomatoes and beans and corn that lined the new shelves in the kitchen like a bright, jeweled inventory of summer. In the evenings they sat together on the step of the cabin that was now their home, and watched the light leave the valley, and talked about everything and nothing, and sometimes sat in the silence that is possible only between people who are completely at ease with each other. And the creek ran in the cottonwoods, and the stars came out over Wyoming in their millions, brilliant and indifferent and beautiful, and Celia Mercer Wells. She had added his name without fanfare or sentiment, simply because it was now true, felt the full, specific weight of a life that she had chosen and built and fought for, and won. In the fall of 1879, she realized she was expecting a child, and she told Oliver on a Sunday afternoon in October while they were stacking firewood for the winter, which was not the most romantic setting but was, in its own way, entirely right for the two of them. She simply stopped what she was doing and looked at him across the woodpile and said, "I believe we are going to have a baby in the spring." Oliver set down the log he was carrying with a precision that suggested his hands were not entirely under his control at that moment, and looked at her with an expression that moved through several things in rapid succession: surprise, which was brief, followed by joy, which was immediate and enormous, followed by the careful, steady look of a man making a set of rapid, practical calculations about responsibility and readiness, and everything he would do to make it right. "Are you well?" he said first. "Perfectly well," she said. "Good," he said. "That is Celia." He came around the woodpile and took her hands in both of his and looked at her face with an intensity that made her eyes sting slightly, which she would not have predicted. How do you feel about it?" She considered the question seriously, which was what it deserved. "Surprised," she said. "Pleased. Somewhat terrified, if I am being honest. And pleased that I am able to be terrified about the right things now instead of the wrong ones." He pulled her into his arms then and held her against him in the October cold, the both of them standing in the wood yard with the smell of pine all around them and the distant sound of the creek, and he said into her hair quietly, "We will do fine. You will do better than fine. You always do." She believed him, because she had learned by then that Oliver Wells did not make promises he was not certain he could keep. The winter of 1879 was kinder than the winter of 1878, which the old-timers in the valley said happened sometimes. The land gave you a hard first year and then eased off slightly, as though testing was over and you had passed. The snow was significant but manageable, and Oliver had laid in enough wood and enough feed for the cattle that they came through without serious loss. Celia spent the winter's interior months doing everything she would normally do, managing the household, working the accounts in the ledger she kept for the property, corresponding with Marcus Webb about a small additional land purchase she was considering to the south of their current boundary. And she did it all with the expanding certainty of the child coming, and the particular knowledge that her body was engaged in building something at the same time her hands were. The baby came in April, which Celia had calculated correctly from the beginning, because she had a good instinct for dates. It was a boy, which Oliver received with a joy that was so unguarded it was almost startling from a man who was normally so measured. And Celia held her son in the firelight of the cabin bedroom with the sound of the spring rain outside, and the world new and clean and washed, and named him James Oliver Wells, for no better reason than that the name felt right. And Oliver sat beside her on the edge of the bed, and held the boy's impossibly small hand in his own large one, and looked as though the world had rearranged itself around him into a shape that finally made complete sense. James grew the way spring things do, fast and with intent, apparently determined to catch up to the world as quickly as possible. He had Oliver's gray eyes and Celia's particular stubbornness, which was simultaneously a marvel and a challenge, and he was crawling before most of the valley's babies reached that stage and walking before he was 11 months old, which Oliver considered a character trait, and Celia considered a logistical problem to be managed. The property continued to grow through 1880 and 1881. Celia completed the additional land purchased to the south in the spring of 1880, expanding their holding to just over 90 acres, and Oliver fenced the new section over the summer with help from two of the neighboring homesteaders with whom they had developed the solid, practical friendships of people who know they depend on each other. The Garvey family, who had arrived the previous fall with 4 children, and a faith in the future that was either admirable or alarming depending on the day, became their nearest friends. Robert Garvey was a man of Oliver's type, quiet, capable, and direct, and his wife, Helen, was the kind of woman Celia would have sought out in any context, warm and funny, and possessed of an absolutely unsentimental approach to the difficulties of frontier life that Celia found deeply refreshing. The four of them established the habit of Sunday dinners, rotating between the two properties, and those dinners became the social center of their week-long, unhurried evenings around the table, with the children underfoot, and the food good and the conversation ranging across everything from cattle prices to what was happening in the territorial legislature, to books that had made their way out from the East and were circulating through the valley's small lending community. It was at one of these Sunday dinners in the fall of 1881 that Oliver told Robert Garvey something that Celia overheard from the kitchen doorway, and which she turned away from to give him the privacy of saying it without being watched, but which she kept and held for a long time afterward. Robert had asked, in the casual way of one friend to another, whether Oliver had ever considered going back east. "Just wondered," Robert said. "You ever miss it? Kentucky." Civilization in the newspaper's opinion of the word. There was a pause, and Celia, standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish in her hands, heard Oliver say, "No, I did not know what I was building toward when I first came out. I thought I did, but I did not. I know now. Everything I have worth keeping is here. There is nothing that is not here." She carried the dish to the table without saying anything about it, and when she set it down and met Oliver's eyes across the table, she saw in them that he knew she had heard, and he did not look away, and she did not either, and something passed between them that needed no words and got none. The following spring brought a second pregnancy, which Celia announced with less ceremony than the first but no less feeling, and in November of 1882 their daughter arrived, a daughter this time, a fact that pleased the entire valley's community of women who had been rooting for one on Celia's behalf. They named her Ruth Ellen Wells, Ellen for Celia's mother, and she had Celia's dark hair, and it became apparent early Oliver's particular quality of attentive stillness. She would sit and watch the world for minutes at a time with an expression of serious consideration that made strangers assume she was much older than she was. James, who was 2.5 when Ruth arrived, received his sister with the same pragmatic acceptance he brought to everything new in his life, studied her for approximately 4 minutes, and then decided she was fine and went back to his own affairs, which at that stage consisted primarily of testing the limits of every fence and enclosure on the property, and of following Oliver around with the particular devotion of a small boy for a father who makes time for him without making a production of it. The years from 1882 to 1885 were the years Celia would look back on later and call, simply, the good years, not because they were without difficulty. There was a grass fire in 1883 that took a section of their north fence and kept Oliver and Robert Garvey and 2 other neighbors out on the fire line for 36 hours straight. And there was a dry summer in 1884 that strained the creek and the garden and required careful management of every resource. But because they were years of full, purposeful, deeply inhabited life, and because in those years everything they had built held together and grew, and because they knew it and were grateful for it. Oliver turned 35 in the summer of 1884, a fact that Celia marked by baking him a proper cake, a brown sugar cake with a boiled sugar frosting that she had been practicing since February and had gotten exactly right by May, and by giving him a new Stetson hat to replace the one that had finally given up entirely in the fall of last year. He put the hat on his head and adjusted the brim with the particular satisfaction of a man receiving exactly the right thing, and kissed her in the kitchen with James and Ruth watching from the doorway, which made Ruth cover her face with her hands and James say, with the considered authority of a 5-year-old, "That is enough of that." Which made Oliver laugh his real laugh, which still, after all the years, was one of Celia's favorite sounds in the world. In the fall of 1885, Oliver made a proposal that had been forming in his mind, she could tell, for some time before he finally said it aloud. He wanted to expand the cattle operation. Not extravagantly, not to become Harlan Tate, who remained in the valley and had mellowed considerably over the years into something approaching a reasonable neighbor. But to grow to a size where they could hire a permanent hand and take some of the physical load off, because the work that two people could do on 90 acres with a growing herd was beginning to exceed what two people could sustain at the pace they had been maintaining. Celia agreed with him because the arithmetic supported it, and because she had her own addition to the proposal. With the profit from the larger herd, she wanted to fund a school for the valley. There were 11 children in the immediate area of Harlan's Creek who were learning from their parents and from whatever books circulated through the informal lending network, and there was no dedicated schoolhouse and no dedicated teacher, and Celia had been turning this problem over in her mind for 2 years. Oliver listened to the school proposal with the attentiveness he always gave to her ideas, and then he said, "How much would it take?" She had the figures ready, because of course she did, and she laid them out and they talked through it over 2 evenings and then agreed on a plan. The expansion of the cattle operation in 1886 and the school fund beginning simultaneously from the household accounts, with the goal of a completed schoolhouse by the end of 1887. It worked. The cattle operation added 60 head over 1886, and they hired a hand, a young man of 22 named Pete Calloway, who was quiet and reliable, and treated the children with the careful respect of someone who had not had much gentleness in his own childhood and was not sure of the etiquette of it. And the school fund grew steadily, supplemented by contributions from the Garvey family and 3 other homesteading families, and in September of 1887, the schoolhouse opened in Harlan's Creek, a single room, properly built, with 6 desks and a chalkboard and a young teacher named Miss Vera Compton who had trained in Cheyenne and come out to the valley with the same clear-eyed pragmatism that Celia had always respected in people who chose this life deliberately. James Wells was 7 when the school opened, and he walked to it on the first morning with his lunch pail, and his slate board and Oliver's gray eyes and Celia's determined stride. And Celia stood at the gate of their property and watched him go, and felt the specific and bittersweet feeling of watching something you have built take its first steps alone. Oliver came and stood beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and they watched James disappear around the bend of the track that led to town. "He is going to be fine," Oliver said. "I know he is," Celia said. "That is not what I am feeling." "What are you feeling?" She leaned against him and thought about it. "Like time is doing the thing it always does," she said, "moving without asking permission." "Like the wind," Oliver said. "Like the wind," she agreed and smiled, and he pulled her closer and they stood there in the morning air of a September day in 1887, with the creek running in the cottonwoods and the valley golden and wide around them. And Celia thought about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 9 years ago with a carpetbag and a deed and a stubbornness that her mother had called her finest flaw. And she thought about everything that woman had been walking toward without knowing it, and she was grateful. Deeply and completely and without reservation, for every hard and improbable mile of it. Ruth started school the following year, in September of 1888, which she approached with the same serious attentiveness she brought to everything, and the 2 Wells children became fixtures of the Harlan's Creek schoolhouse in the way that children of parents who believe firmly in education tend to become interested, engaged, and occasionally a challenge for their teacher in the most worthwhile sense. The valley had changed considerably in the decades since Celia's arrival. There were more homesteading families. The town of Harlan's Creek had grown to include a second general store, a proper post office, a doctor who came through twice monthly from Laramie, and a small public library that the homesteading community had established by pooling their books and establishing a lending system. The railroad had reached a point 20 miles south of the valley, which meant that the practical business of getting supplies and getting cattle to market had become considerably more efficient, though the town itself retained the essential quality of a place where people knew each other, and the landscape was still the largest presence in any given day. Oliver's property and Celia's original 40 acres. All of it was their land now, entirely bound together by the life they had built on it, had grown to 120 acres with the purchase of an additional section to the west in 1886. The cattle herd was healthy and well managed. Pete Calloway had been with them for 3 years and had become genuinely part of the household in the way that hired hands sometimes did in the frontier economy, eating his meals at their table and watching the children grow with the uncomplicated affection of someone who has been given a place to belong. In the evenings, which were still their time, Oliver and Celia sat on the new porch they had built along the front of the expanded cabin, the cabin that was now a proper house, 4 rooms and a sleeping loft, and a kitchen with real glass windows. And the pattern of those evenings was so established and so good that Celia sometimes thought she could feel the weight of all the previous evenings in this one, layered and accumulated like the rings of a tree, each one adding something to the whole. They talked about everything that required discussion and rested in the silence that required nothing. Oliver still had the habit of watching the horizon with the sustained attention of a man who had learned that the frontier communicated in the language of weather and light. And Celia still had the habit of reading in the evenings when there was enough light. And sometimes she would look up from her page and find him watching her instead of the horizon. And the expression on his face was the one she had first seen in the doorway of the cabin in the lamplight 10 years ago, naked and unguarded and entirely hers. "What are you thinking?" she would ask sometimes. And sometimes he would tell her, and sometimes he would say, "Nothing that needs words," which she had learned meant something that was complete in itself and did not require the additional weight of language. She understood that. She had always understood it. In the spring of 1889, the year that Wyoming was working toward statehood, it would be achieved in 1890, and there was great feeling throughout the territory about it, the sense of something settling into its final and proper form. Celia discovered she was expecting a 3rd child. She was 35, which was not young for a 3rd pregnancy in 1889, but was not remarkable either. And she told Oliver with the same directness she had always brought to important information, and he received it with the same steadiness he had always brought to important information. And they looked at each other across the kitchen table and both smiled slowly, the smiles of people for whom joy has long since ceased to be a surprise and has become instead a well-established resident. The 3rd child arrived in November of 1889, on a day when the first proper snow of the season was falling outside the bedroom window in fat, soft flakes that muffled the world and made everything outside look like something out of a painting. It was another boy, which James, now 9, received with open satisfaction, having lobbied informally for a brother for the better part of 2 years. Ruth, at 7, received the news with her characteristic equanimity, and immediately set about organizing the practical details of the baby's introduction to the household, with an efficiency that made both Oliver and Celia look at each other with expressions of recognition. They named him Thomas Leonard Wells Thomas for Oliver's father, Leonard for Celia's father, and he came into the world with a voice that left no ambiguity about his opinions, which was different from both of his siblings' introductions to life, and which Pete Calloway, hearing it from the barn where he had been very correctly keeping himself busy, later reported had been audible at a considerable distance. A fact he reported with a grin that was the widest Celia had ever seen on his usually composed face. Thomas grew up shouting and running and climbing things and falling off them and getting up and climbing them again, and the household that had been already full became fuller in the specific, warm, complicated way of households, with 3 children at different stages. James at 9 was half boy and half something older, beginning to move into the work of the property with Oliver in the early mornings, learning the management of the cattle and the maintenance of the fences, with the serious attention of someone who understood that this land was both his inheritance and his responsibility. Ruth at 7 was her mother's companion in the garden and the kitchen and the accounts, not out of gender expectation, but out of genuine interest and the particular intelligence that understood that the numbers in the ledger were the language of the property's health and deserved serious study. Thomas at 1, and then 2, and then 3 was a force of nature unto himself, and the family organized itself around this fact with good humor and genuine love. When Wyoming achieved statehood in July of 1890, Harlan's Creek celebrated in the way of small frontier communities. A gathering in the town square, speeches by people who felt strongly about it, a meal that was partly organized and partly contributed by everyone who arrived, fiddle music in the evening, and the particular celebratory quality of a place that feels itself finally and formally acknowledged as real. Oliver and Celia were there with all 3 children, and the evening ended with the fireworks that a business association in Laramie had sent down, not many, but enough to make the sky above Harlan's Creek brilliant for a few minutes in the summer dark. And Thomas, who was 8 months old and had been asleep in Celia's arms, woke at the first explosion and stared up at the light in the sky with his mouth open and his eyes very wide. And then he looked at his mother's face to see how to feel about it. And she was looking up at the sky with a smile so full and real that he appeared to decide it was good, and he looked back up at the fireworks with an expression of wondering acceptance. Oliver was watching both of them, wife and son, against the Wyoming sky on the night of statehood, and when Celia turned to find him watching, she did what she had been doing for years and read the expression on his face as easily and completely as she read any of her books. "Happy," she said. "There is not a word," he said, "for what I am." She reached out and took his hand and held it, which was something she had been doing for 11 years and still felt, each time, like a choice she was making actively and with her whole self. James, who was 10 and had been standing nearby, looked at his parents with the dignified embarrassment of a 10-year-old observing adult sentiment and said, "Can we have more of Mrs. Elliott's cake before it is gone?" "You may," Celia said. "You only get 1 more piece," Oliver said. "2," James said. 1.5, Oliver said, and the negotiation continued into the summer evening while the last of the fireworks faded, and the stars came out over Wyoming, new state and ancient sky, and Celia Wells stood in the warm night air of the July of 1890 with her youngest child in her arms and her husband's hand in hers, and the sound of her older children's voices carrying in the clear air, and felt the full, completed shape of a life that she had built from nothing but her own 2 hands and her refusal to come here for easy. She thought of the woman she had been on that first stagecoach day, determined and afraid, and carrying everything she owned in 2 bags. She thought of the wind that had hit her when she stepped down, and how it had not asked permission. She thought of Oliver coming around the corner of the general store with his fence wire and his burlap sack, and the way his gray eyes had looked at her across the air between them, steady and curious, and already, she thought now, beginning something. She thought about the mortar and the door hinges, and the fence that had been cut, and the legal notice, and the ride to Laramie, and the summer by the creek, and all the evenings on the step that became a porch that became a life. She thought about the day she had walked up to her land for the first time and felt the cold water of the creek run over her hands, and the day she had stood in the lamplight doorway of the cabin and said yes when Oliver asked if he could court her, and the March morning she had walked down the center aisle of the Harlan's Creek church in her blue wool dress toward the man who was already watching the door for her. She thought about James on his first day of school, and Ruth in the garden, and Thomas asleep in this very spot an hour ago before the fireworks woke him. The frontier had not been easy. It had never been easy. It had been cold and dry and legally contested and physically relentless and full of difficulty that she could not always see coming and could not always manage as smoothly as she would have liked. It had tested her in ways she could not have imagined from the comfortable remove of a St. Louis parlor. But she had not come here for easy. She had come here for real, and real was what she had found, in all its uncomplicated, demanding, profound enormity, and she would not have traded a day of it, not even the hard ones, not even the days when the wind came without permission, and the sky pressed down gray and everything seemed too much, because all of it together had made exactly this. This night, this husband, these children, this land under a state sky in the summer of 1890. Oliver squeezed her hand as though he knew what she was thinking, which after 11 years he very nearly could, and she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and no words passed between them because none were needed. And the last stars of the Wyoming summer night came out one by one above Harlan's Creek, above the cottonwoods along the creek, above the cabin that was now a house, above the good land that was fully, properly, irrevocably theirs. And the night was warm, and the future was long, and the life they had built together was as solid and real and enduring as the land beneath their feet. James came back with 1.5 of Mrs. Elliott's cake and crumbs on his chin, and Ruth was close behind him with Thomas toddling between them on uncertain legs, reaching up to hold his sister's hand, and Oliver scooped Thomas up with one arm without breaking stride, and the boy grabbed his father's collar, and held on with the unconscious trust of children who have never had reason to doubt. And Celia took Ruth's hand, and the family walked together back through the warm July night toward the wagon and the horses and the road home, toward the creek and the cottonwoods and the porch where they would sit in the last of the summer evening before the children went to bed, and the night grew quiet, and the stars wheeled slowly overhead in the great clear Wyoming sky. It was a good life. It was a full one. It was everything she had come for and more than she had known to want, and it was hers, completely and permanently and with all the weight of real things that endure.